Well, Grant's asked me to talk this morning a little bit about what I learned from my trips to and involvement with the Grace School, about which you already know something, and if you don't, we'll read more on the notice boards in the church hall. This privilege that I've had to be involved with that over the years. What have I been learning from that? And I think the first lesson is summed up in the words of, I think that was probably the very first song that we ever heard as we stood in front of those African children at their assembly. And assembly is outdoors there, they don't have a hall. And you see these 200 or 300 children, I don't know how many it was there, absolutely pouring their hearts out to God in praise. You see one or two pictures, they sort of sway in time and they raise their hands and they're just lost in praise and worship. And the song was, "What a mighty God we serve," which has come to mean a lot to us. What a mighty God. We are just vessels. It says in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul writes, "We have this treasure in earthen vessels," that's jars of clay in modern translation, "to show that the transcendent power belongs to God and not to us." And I felt that many times over the years at the Grace School. Times when we've seen God answering prayers, when we're just sort of desperate and depending on Him. He is orchestrating, often behind the scenes. We only see a tiny, tiny fraction of the work that God's doing. He's putting things in place. Often when we're waiting, and I'm an impatient kind of person, God, do it now! But he's waiting, linking people together, preparing, answering prayers, and His timing, as we've so often seen, is perfect. It isn't our timing, which is why we sometimes get frustrated, but we need patience. So that's something that I saw in the way I got involved with the Grace School, which is quite a long story in itself, but God just putting all sorts of connections in place for me for several years before we first went there. And you can only see afterwards that He was doing that. Just think back to Moses on that mountain, Sinai, Horeb. God's been waiting for some time already to save His people. But Moses wasn't ready. Moses started out thinking he could do it himself in his own strength, didn't he? "Oh, I'll sort this out." And he ends up killing somebody, manslaughter, running away, on the wanted list. The last thing he wants to do is to get a call to go back to Africa. He's in semi-retirement. But this burning bush attracts his attention. And God calls him. "I'm sending you." I can understand why Moses called to this huge task. There's 1.5 million people there in slavery to the most powerful king in the world who will not want to let them go. Me? He's probably about 79 years old. "Yes, Moses, but I will be with you." That's all you need. I will be with you. You won't know till afterwards, but the proof will be when you get back to this mountain. You'll know then. And we've seen that so often when God's called us to things, that you have doubts and you think, when I first got the picture about the kitchen and the restaurant, I almost just sat on it and did nothing with it at all, really. But I've learned over the years with the Grace School that when God calls, say yes. And when He gives you a nudge, follow it. So that's why I contacted Hendrik and said, I just had this picture of a kitchen and a dining hall. And he said, "Wow, that's amazing." And I thought, "Is it?" And he said, "I've just had the same thing." And we knew then that this was something a bit special, but we still thought this is huge. so we better get a third sign. And then the third person saw a building site at the Grace School. So, okay, Lord, you're in this. It's time for us to say yes. And I want to encourage all of you, because God will call you to things. He probably is already, to say yes. I don't know what that might be. And you may not know it until afterwards. But don't think if you do get a call to do something that God needs you. He doesn't. He didn't need me. And he could have done the whole thing by himself, or just called other people to do things at the Grace School. And we should never get too big for our boots and think that we're special. Paul wrote, nor is he served, this is in Acts 17, nor is he served by human hands, as if he needed anything, since he gives to all men life and breath and everything. This is the infinite God we're talking about here. He doesn't need me, but he graciously invites us to be part of his work, to be partners with Christ, to be partakers. Not because he needs us or it bigs him up or anything, but for our blessing. And that's what I found on my trips to South Africa. I have never felt so alive, so spiritually alive especially, as in my times there at the Grace School. And just this week I had an email from someone I recommended to go there 2 weeks ago, and she said, words cannot express the joy I felt when I was in that school. It's just that feeling. And on our first trip, everything just went so perfectly. I was not equipped for that. I'd only ever been abroad once since we got married, and that was only to Europe. And here I was taking, a dozen, or no, half a dozen in those days, children across the world into a black township. I didn't have a clue what we were going into. I hadn't been able to go out there and do a recce, but God had put someone in place there who knew me and who was going to be chaperone, which was great. His provision. Well, I had to learn that it wasn't me that he needed. The only ability I needed was availability. And then he gives us responsibility. In fact, a lot of the ideas I had over the years to help the Grace School they just fell flat. They came to nothing. The ideas that seemed to take off and be successful were the ideas that other people had, especially the children I took with us. They had all sorts of plans, and those have been the ones that have come to fruition, not mine. Well, maybe until this vision of the kitchen anyway, if that comes about. I'm sure it will, because God's called us to it. So that's a lesson that I've learned, that when we respond and act in his will, fully dependent on him, trying to fulfill his purpose for our lives, that's when we're at our most alive. That is the abundant life that Jesus said he came on earth to give us. And a lot of us settle for a lot less than that because we want to stay in our comfort zones. But that comfort zone is not where you grow. You grow and you learn when you get moved out of it. And I was certainly out of my comfort zone. I remember one night, on the first night in Seaboo's on one trip, just thinking, God, what am I doing here? What is this place? It's so different, and I just felt very homesick. Don't worry, I will be with you, he says. Another lesson that I learned is that it's not wealth that brings us joy or peace or security. Those things, they don't come from wealth. Wealth is actually very insecure. You can do some good things with it, though. No, it's the Lord who brings that joy. And I remember at my very first trip, one of the children coming back saying, I never knew that people with so little could be so happy. Because everywhere in the Grace School you went, people were happy. The children were smiling. Yet they came from desperate backgrounds, some of them. A girl I sponsored lived in a garden shed. On our first trip, we took the children and we were taken to meet a girl who was bringing up her younger brother and sister on her own. She was about 16 maybe. She didn't take us into the house. She didn't have anywhere we could sit down. She brought out to us a wooden crate, if you wanted to sit on it. That's poverty. People with no electricity. Some of the children are coming from that backgrounds of abuse and often not having parents. I tell the story of Mandla, one of the success stories of the past, but he was picked up by the teachers at the Grace School, scavenging in the bins at Siabuswa. I don't know what had happened to his parents. Dads often are absent, if they're still alive, might have died of AIDS. Mandla was living with his alcoholic grandfather, who couldn't provide for him. He was taken to the Grace School, he got sponsorship, he got through matriculation, he got to university, he got a good job, and I proudly see him on Facebook with his car. Wow, what a transformation in life, and that's happened before. Zatile was about to be kicked out of the school when we happened to be there at the time, and we said, well, we've got a bit of spare cash for souvenirs and stuff. How much would it keep her here this year? And it was the same amount as we had in spare, so we gave it. That girl became head girl of the school, went to university, and is now, I think, something in the field of biological sciences. I see her on LinkedIn. She's getting on really well. Transformation. God can do that. Small things can make a really big difference, is another thing that I learned. We went to another house where the mother was a worker at the Grace School. Father, I don't know, he was not around. Mother was bringing up children on her own. She had a little boy that was already being sponsored by some parents. And she was so glad to welcome us into her home. It was pretty grim. And I said to her, are you scared, being on your own in an area of quite high crime? And she said, at night, yes. But I pray to God. But I am sad at the moment, she said, because we had a guard dog and it's dead. And I think it was poisoned. We came home and found him dead in the yard. I said, well, can we get you a new guard dog? How much will that cost? And so we used some cash and gave her that. And also, it was enough to fix her broken gutter. When it rains in Siabuswa, it really pours. And so we got that, paid for that to be done as well. And she was just so grateful. She was in tears of joy. It was like her life had been transformed. I took those children back to our place where we were staying. And we met the other children who'd been out on a shopping trip to get the chocolates and the sweets and things that we used to enjoy in the evenings when we were there. They had spent the same amount on chocolate as we spent turning that woman's life around. Small things can make a really big difference. So just to bring you up to date with where we are at the moment and the graciousness of God in bringing us here, because He's called us to this project, which is the largest by far we've ever attempted, and shown us that it's bigger than just a kitchen and a dining room. This is going to be, let me explain. In February I met with a couple of people that I hadn't met since before the pandemic, who used to be parents of a child at St Andrews, and they're South Africans. And a man called Dennis runs a company. He's a sort of CEO, and he's operating partly remotely. And we were just catching up with each other, and they asked about the Grace School, and I told them about the kitchen project. And Dennis, he's a serious businessman. His eyes welled up with tears. I thought, what's going on here? Never seen him like that. And he said, Richard, I didn't know this, but the company that I run, one of the things we do is hospitality, and we provide kitchens for like miners and building sites and people travelling. And he said, we had a big order up in Botswana, and then there was an election, the government changed, they changed the rules, they won't work with South African companies anymore. I've got a holiday kitchen equipment sitting in Botswana. I've been saying to God, what do I do with this? I think I know what you can do with it, Dennis. He said, we can even use the social responsibility allowance that we have to bring it back to South Africa. The previous year, Dennis had been the one who had given us the PPE that we got into the Grace School. And he said the government's encouraging companies to link with particular organisations like schools and stick with it, not just do a one-off. So they'll be pleased if we bring this stuff back, and you can have the kitchen equipment for free. So we just got to build the building. But not only that, he said, we can offer training. And Driki, the tears rolling down her face, she said, I'm a chef. I can do school menus. I can give training. Wow, I had no idea. That was God's gracious planning of all this. You see what I mean about orchestrating in advance? That is incredible. And then just a bit more recently, it was just about April, and I was feeling a bit down because it was obvious that my litter picking venture isn't taking off this year. You know, last year, thanks to people like you, it was amazing, and we raised about £3,000, which paid for the architect and the engineer to do all the drawings and get the plans up, and even left a bit spare at the end. Fantastic. But this year, didn't seem to be anything like that interest. I guess cost of living crisis and the Ukraine war has changed the whole picture. And I was about to go to the filling station, which I recommend, Thursday evenings down at Hampstead, Norris, once a month. Brilliant time for local churches like this, people to get together. But I had a headache and I was feeling a bit miserable, and I don't think I'll go this time. And then I got a text message from the chap who took over at my position at St Andrews when I retired. And he'd been on a trip to the Grace with me, and he knew about the project for the kitchen, and he had applied to a trust fund. And I got the message that evening, £10,000 granted from the trust fund. Yes, praise God. Way more than anything I could raise. And so I thought, I've got to go to the filling station, I've got to tell them. And so I stood up there and I gave him this story. One woman there was so moved, she said, I'm responsible. She gave £600. Just because I went. And because James sent that message as soon as he got it and sent it to me. You know, little nudges. Well, I better stop talking here. You can catch me more over coffee if you want to. But remember that if you want to have an abundant life with our mighty God, who is working all these things out for our good, whose timing is perfect, you just need to say yes. Be listening for that voice. Let's pray. Our gracious God, thank you so much that you ask us to take part in these things you call us to, not for your benefit, but for our own, and for those we serve. We pray that you'll help us to discern your will and your call, whatever it is that you want us to be doing, or praying, or giving to, or going to, or standing up for in these weeks ahead. And give us grace to follow you in obedience. Amen.